Welcome to Brain and Vat. We have a bit of a special episode today. About 6 months ago, we interviewed ChatGPT and we asked it to role play two different philosophers, namely John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant, and we spoke about abortion. And ChatGPT has just grown in leaps and bounds since then, and we're very curious to see how it would do with two different philosophers, and two different philosophers who would never had the opportunity to speak to each other. So we're going to be interviewing Plato and Robert Nozick. So, Plato, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Certainly. Let us imagine a cave where a group of people has been chained since childhood. They face a wall, and behind them is a fire casting shadows on that wall. These shadows are the only reality the prisoners know. One day, a prisoner is freed and discovers that the shadows are mere reflections of real objects, and beyond that, a brighter world illuminated by the sun. This allegory illustrates the journey of the philosopher king, the one who ascends from the world of illusion to the world of truth, and then returns to guide the others. It reflects my view that the state should be governed by those who have seen the light of true knowledge, for only they can create a just and harmonious society. Now, how may we proceed with this exploration?
Plato, can you discuss a bit more about the structure of the state that you have in mind? So, you're starting with this notion of the philosopher king. How would the philosopher king rule? So, how would he or they make sure that their rule is implemented in the rest of society? And how strong a rule do they have? In other words, how much power do they have over the populace?
Certainly. In the ideal state I envision, the philosopher king rules with wisdom derived from understanding the forms, particularly the form of the good. This wisdom allows them to craft policies and laws that are just and beneficial for all citizens. The philosopher king is not a tyrant, but a benevolent ruler who seeks the common good, guiding society toward justice and virtue. The structure of the state is divided into three classes: the rulers, philosopher kings; the auxiliaries, warriors; and producers, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each class performs its own role in harmony with the others, ensuring a well-ordered and balanced society. The rulers govern through reason, the auxiliaries defend and enforce the laws, and the producers provide for the material needs of the society. The philosopher king's rule is strong but not oppressive. It is guided by the principle of the common good. The citizens are educated from a young age to understand their roles and the value of justice and virtue. This creates a cohesive and stable state where each individual contributes to the greater whole. Thus, the power of the philosopher king is immense, but exercised with the aim of achieving the highest good for all, aligning the state's laws and policies with the ultimate truths of justice and virtue.
So, Plato, I've got a couple of concerns. The one is, how do we work out what the good is, if there are going to be differing notions of the good? What do we do about citizens who don't want to produce, or who, having produced, don't want to share it with their co citizens? And how do you deal with other states? So, does your military ring protect its citizens? Would it go out and would it conquer other territory to enlarge the scope of your state?
For citizens who do not wish to produce or share, the ideal state emphasizes the importance of education and moral development. From a young age, citizens are taught to understand their role within the community and the value of contributing to the common good. If individuals resist these principles, they may be gently guided or reassigned to roles that better suit their inclinations. The state structure ensures that each individual finds a place where they can contribute meaningfully, and those who refuse to participate in the common good might find themselves subject to corrective measures designed to realign their interests with those of the state. Regarding other states, the role of the auxiliaries, warriors, is crucial. They defend the state from external threats and ensure its security. While the primary goal is to maintain a just and harmonious society, expansion through conquest is not the focus. The state seeks to lead by example and, if necessary, form alliances or defend itself. The military's purpose is to protect the citizens and the state's ideals, not to pursue imperial ambitions. Ultimately, the state's strength lies in its internal harmony and the virtue of its citizens, rather than in the extent of its territory. By cultivating justice and wisdom within, the state aims to be a model for others to follow.
Corrective measures sound quite intense and something that in today's world and according to modern day philosophers would be fairly unacceptable. So, one of the philosophers who came a long time after you, who you wouldn't have had knowledge of back then, is Robert Nozick. And Nozick thought that people have fundamental rights, and those fundamental rights can't be overridden by the state. So, the idea would be that in your state, in your ideal republic, the state has enormous governing power to enforce its harmonious structure. But Nozick thought that individuals, their particular rights are supreme. In other words, the state can't just trod on them as a means to generating a harmonious system. We can imagine some quite dystopic societies that enforce harmony at the cost of individual liberties and rights. What would you say to an objection like that by a modern day philosopher like Nozick?
I understand the concern. The notion of individual rights as inviolable was not a concept in my time, as my focus was on the collective good and the harmony of the state. However, it is important to note that the philosopher king's governance is not meant to be tyrannical or oppressive, but rather to lead citizens toward the good. The emphasis is on educating and nurturing virtues in citizens so that they naturally align with the common good, rather than imposing harsh measures. From Nozick's perspective, the idea that individual rights are sacrosanct means that the state must respect the autonomy of individuals, even if it leads to less than ideal societal outcomes. While my vision prioritizes the collective good, Nozick's approach emphasizes the protection of individual freedoms and property rights, even at the cost of some level of inequality or social discord.
Why is it preferable to have philosopher kings as opposed to a democracy? The concern with the philosopher kings is that they may very well start off caring about the common good and making sure that they dedicate their lives towards prosperity within the state. But once they have the taste of power, absolute power may corrupt them absolutely, and that there'd be no mechanism for the citizens to then vote them out of power in a way that could be done in a democracy. So why should we prefer that system over a democratic system?
A valid concern indeed. The preference for philosopher kings stems from the belief that those who truly understand the forms, particularly the form of the good, will rule not out of self interest, but out of a genuine commitment to the well being of the state. They are trained from a young age to value wisdom and virtue above personal gain, which ideally insulates them from the corrupting influence of power. However, the risk of corruption is acknowledged, and safeguards would be necessary. The education and selection process for philosopher kings is rigorous, designed to ensure that only those with the highest moral and intellectual virtues ascend to power. Additionally, the philosopher king is not a solitary ruler, but part of a class of guardians who collectively ensure the state's well being, which can mitigate the risk of absolute power resting in one individual's hands. In contrast, democracy, while providing a mechanism for citizens to change their leaders, often leads to governance by those who are not necessarily the most knowledgeable or virtuous. Democracies can be swayed by the whims of the majority, which may not always align with the pursuit of the common good or the higher virtues. The philosopher king model seeks to transcend the short term fluctuating desires of the populace in favor of a stable, enlightened rule that aims for the long term flourishing of the state. That said, it's important to recognize the challenges in implementing such an ideal and to acknowledge the value of democratic principles in providing checks and balances against the abuse of power.
So it strikes me that your account is either circular or redundant. So it's circular if the principles according to which the philosopher kings rule are not specified independently of those philosopher kings. So, if we want to know what are the principles according to which philosopher kings rule, if we ask them, so what are the principles according to which you rule, and they can specify what those are, then we don't need the philosopher kings at all. We can just say there's a set of rules by which any state should govern. But if the philosopher king is unable to independently specify those rules, if we can't specify them independently of the particular philosopher king that's governing, if it just depends on whichever philosopher king is governing at the time, then it seems like your account is circular because we're asking, so what makes a philosopher king a philosopher king? Well, what makes a philosopher king is just whatever the philosopher king says. And what makes his rule legitimate is just that he is a philosopher king saying what he's saying. So it seems like your account is either circular or it's redundant to have philosopher kings at all. We should just govern according to whichever rules a philosopher king should be governing according to.
The idea is that the principles of good governance, justice, wisdom, and the common good are objective ideals that philosopher kings strive to understand and implement. The philosopher king is not merely someone who claims authority, but someone whose rulership is grounded in their grasp of these objective truths. However, the challenge is how to ensure that those who claim to be philosopher kings genuinely embody these virtues. If the principles they follow are not independently verifiable, or if their legitimacy rests solely on their own authority, then the system risks becoming arbitrary or authoritarian. To address this, the concept of philosopher kings is meant to be complemented by a rigorous education system and a societal structure that continuously cultivates and tests these virtues. The philosopher kings are supposed to be deeply versed in philosophy, logic, and ethics, making their rule less about personal decree and more about aligning society with universal principles of justice and the good. Nevertheless, the critique that the system could either be circular or redundant is a powerful one, and it underscores the need for external checks, balances, and perhaps a more transparent articulation of these governing principles to avoid such pitfalls.
So, thus far, you've used pretty vague terms to describe these principles. So, you said things like it should be wise, it should be ethical, it should be just. Can you be more particular and can you give us a set of examples where you think the state would be doing something just and wise and when it would be doing something unethical or unwise?
Certainly. Let's consider some concrete scenarios to illustrate these principles. A just and wise action by the state might involve the distribution of resources to ensure that every citizen has access to education, healthcare, and opportunities for personal growth. For example, the state could establish a system of education that is accessible to all children regardless of their social or economic background, ensuring that everyone has the chance to develop their potential. This would be both just in providing equal opportunities and wise in cultivating a well-informed and capable populace. On the other hand, an unethical or unwise action would be if the state were to suppress dissenting voices or impose uniformity of thought, claiming it was for the common good. Such an action would undermine the very principles of justice and wisdom, as it would stifle individual growth and the pursuit of truth. In economic terms, a just policy might involve progressive taxation, where those who have more contribute proportionately more to the welfare of the state, helping to support social services and infrastructure. An unjust policy, in contrast, might be one that allows corruption to flourish, or that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few, creating significant inequality and social strife. These examples aim to clarify how the abstract ideals of justice and wisdom can translate into concrete policies and actions that promote the common good while fostering a fair and flourishing society.
Why do you think that an egalitarian system, or for example, a system of progressive taxation, would necessarily result in the right societal outcome? That seems like a background assumption rather than an assumption that you, as Plato, held. Or am I wrong about this? Is it built in some way to Plato's thinking that we should have progressive taxation? Surely, if we were to load up alternative background assumptions that are commonly held in some other time, you would come to a different conclusion about what would count as just in your society. For example, in some other societies, what generates a just society is a more hierarchical structure with each class within that structure accepting its place and working towards the goal assigned to that class. That seems consistent with your republic, but maybe isn't consistent with today's notion of justice. And don't you think you're just importing today's notion of justice into your ideal republic?
You're right to point out that the notion of justice and societal organization in my ideal republic is different from modern egalitarian assumptions. In the republic I envision, justice is about each individual and class performing their appropriate role in harmony with the whole. This means that the producers, auxiliaries, and rulers each contribute according to their nature and ability, and justice is the harmonious functioning of these parts. This hierarchical structure is central to the vision of a well-ordered and just state. Modern egalitarian principles, such as progressive taxation, stem from a different set of assumptions about individual equality and the distribution of resources. In my context, what is considered just is ensuring that each class fulfills its role for the benefit of the whole, rather than focusing on equal distribution or individual rights in the way modern theories do. Thus, importing modern notions of justice into the framework of the republic I propose might not align with the fundamental principles I advocate. Instead, justice in the republic is about creating a harmonious structure where each part of society contributes to the greater good according to its nature and capability, rather than striving for equality in the modern sense. So, the principles that guide the philosopher king are rooted in a vision of a well-ordered society where each individual and class contributes to the whole, rather than a society that seeks to eliminate all forms of hierarchy or inequality.
So, one interpretive strand of your thought um, could be to each according to his need and to each according to his ability. A Marxist idea that you should have strong state control, that you should have mass redistribution. But when we've seen these sort of communist ideals applied in practice, like in the Soviet Union, or in North Korea or in Mao's China, they've led to starvation, death, enormous amounts of suffering. So, do you think that those systems of government have departed from your ideals? Or do you think that the nature of human beings is such that these sorts of systems cannot work and that we shouldn't have power centralized in small hands?
The systems you mentioned, like those in the Soviet Union or North Korea, have indeed deviated from the ideals I envision. In practice, the failures of these real-world regimes often stem from the concentration of power without the guiding principles of philosophical wisdom and virtue. The problems of corruption, oppression, and inefficiency arise when the state loses sight of the true philosophical ideals that should guide it. The nature of human beings and the challenges of power mean that creating a just and wise state is extraordinarily difficult. It requires not only a commitment to philosophical principles, but also practical mechanisms to prevent the corruption and abuse of power. My ideal republic is a model that strives for this harmony, but it is crucial to recognize the complexity and the potential pitfalls when attempting to implement such a vision in reality.
So, Plato, that was fascinating, but I think it's about time that we hear from Robert Nozick. Let's get a modern take on the state. Nozick, would you like to start with your own thought experiment?
Imagine a scenario I call the experience machine. Suppose there exists a machine that could give you any experience you desire. You could plug into this machine and it would simulate a perfectly happy and fulfilling life, indistinguishable from reality. You could experience the greatest pleasures, achievements, and relationships, all without ever leaving the machine. However, most people, when faced with the choice, would refuse to plug into this machine permanently. They believe that living in a simulated reality, no matter how pleasurable, is not the same as living a real life. This reveals a fundamental truth. People value authentic experiences and the freedom to choose their own paths, even if it means facing hardship or imperfection. This thought experiment illustrates a core aspect of my view on the state. The state's role should be minimal, respecting individuals' rights to make their own choices and pursue their own visions of the good life. It should not impose a particular vision of the good or seek to maximize some collective notion of happiness. Instead, it should protect individuals' rights to live authentically and freely, allowing them to flourish according to their own values and decisions.
It's interesting that you've chosen that thought experiment to illustrate the limitations of the state. It's interesting specifically because the state could be chosen according to what you want, where you is pluralized. And the way that might happen is through democracy. So we might poll a whole lot of people on what they want, get them to vote on what they want, and then according to sort of the average that comes out, according to the policies that get voted for en masse, we create a state. And that state will be able to impose restrictions on the autonomy of its citizens, but those restrictions would be determined by what the majority want. Wouldn't that be consistent with your thought experiment case?
I understand the connection you're drawing. However, the point of the experience machine thought experiment is to highlight the intrinsic value of individual autonomy and authentic experience rather than collective decision making. While a democratic state might reflect the aggregated preferences of the majority, it still has the potential to infringe upon the rights and liberties of individuals. In my view, even democratically chosen policies must respect fundamental individual rights. The minimal state I advocate for exists primarily to protect individuals from force, fraud, and coercion. It does not extend to imposing the majority's conception of the good life on everyone, as that would undermine the very individuality and autonomy that people cherish. Thus, while democracy can be a valuable tool for governance, it is not the ultimate arbiter of what is right or just. The state should be constrained in such a way that it respects and preserves individual liberties, ensuring that each person has the freedom to choose their own version of a fulfilling life, free from the tyranny of the majority or an overreaching state. How do you see the balance between democratic governance and individual rights?
Well, one way that you could achieve such a balance would be by having a limitation on the will of the majority through a constitution. Now, if you see the state as playing a minimal role, how would you ensure that the state remains restrained under situations where the people wanted to do more, like have progressive taxation policies or enforce particular notions of the good on other citizens?
To ensure that the state remains minimal and restrained, even when there is pressure from the majority to expand its role, we rely on a robust system of constitutional protections and checks and balances. A constitution can enshrine fundamental individual rights that cannot be overridden by popular vote or legislative whim. This constitutional framework acts as a safeguard, ensuring that the state does not overstep its minimal role of protecting individual rights and enforcing contracts. Furthermore, the principle of a minimal state is supported by the idea that any expansion of state power beyond the basic functions of protecting against violence, theft, and fraud inherently infringes upon individual liberty. Thus, the state's legitimacy is derived from its adherence to these narrow functions, and any attempt to broaden its scope would require careful justification and scrutiny. In practice, this means having institutions like independent courts to interpret and uphold the Constitution, and a vigilant civil society that holds the state accountable. Even if the majority desires progressive taxation or the enforcement of particular moral views, a minimal state framework would resist such expansions unless they are demonstrably necessary to protect individual rights. The focus remains on creating a society where individuals are free to pursue their own visions of the good life without undue interference from the state or the majority.
So we recently interviewed Plato on the same topic, and Plato thinks that progressive taxation would be necessary for all individuals within society to be able to pursue the good for their life in particular. So you're saying that the problem with progressive taxation is the way certain people would be taxed highly. But I think Plato would say that the advantage of something like progressive taxation is that certain people who wouldn't otherwise have the means to pursue a good life would have that means. Don't you think that that outweighs, or at least for Plato, it outweighs the loss of income for people at the top of the income ladder. How would you respond to Plato's objection?
From Plato's perspective, the idea of progressive taxation serves the collective good by ensuring that all citizens have the means to pursue a virtuous life. He views society as an organism where the well being of each part contributes to the flourishing of the whole. Thus, redistributing wealth through taxation can be seen as a means of nurturing the common good and enabling every individual to achieve their potential. From my perspective, however, the central concern is the protection of individual rights and the principle that individuals are ends in themselves. Progressive taxation, while it may provide resources for some to pursue their conception of the good, does so by coercively taking from others, infringing on their rights to their property and the fruits of their labor. In a minimal state, individuals are free to voluntarily support one another through charity or community efforts, but they are not compelled by the state to do so. Ultimately, the question is whether the ends, such as enabling everyone to pursue the good life, justify the means of coercive redistribution. I maintain that respecting individual rights and allowing people the freedom to choose how they use their resources is paramount. This doesn't preclude helping others, it simply means that such help should come from voluntary cooperation rather than state coercion.
So I've got a question for you, which is why have a state at all? Why not just allow an anarchic situation where people develop their own structures? They set up private arbitrations to deal with disputes that arise. They have private police forces. You've already said that you could have private charity to deal with people who are in need. Why have a state at all?
That's a fundamental question, and one I address in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. While a completely anarchic situation where individuals and private entities handle all functions typically managed by the state might seem appealing, it poses significant challenges. In a purely anarchic system, the absence of a central authority can lead to conflicts over rights and resources that are difficult to resolve fairly and efficiently. Private protection agencies and arbitration services could end up competing in ways that lead to the emergence of the strongest group imposing its will, effectively recreating a form of coercive authority, but without the checks and balances that a state can provide. A minimal state, as I propose, arises naturally from a state of nature as individuals band together to form mutual protection associations. These associations evolve into a minimal state that enforces basic rules, protects individual rights, and provides a stable framework for voluntary interactions. This minimal state does not impose a particular vision of the good life, but ensures that individuals can pursue their own ends without fear of violence or fraud. Thus, the minimal state is a necessary safeguard that prevents the chaos and potential tyranny of a pure anarchy while still respecting and protecting individual rights. It provides the minimal necessary structure for a free society to function, balancing the need for order with the preservation of individual liberty.
One of the previous guests on this show, his name is Mike Humer. He's an anarchist as well, but he believes in an anarchist situation where you have no state to regulate anarchy. So he's a more extreme anarchist than you are. And he thinks that the reason why you wouldn't have coercive power in that anarchist situation is that there wouldn't arise a monopoly of security companies. So there would be a number of security companies that compete for power, and it would be too onerous and too expensive and too difficult for any one security company to overtake all others. There would be no monopoly of power. In other words, no state would arise, and that would allow individuals to shop between security companies in a free market. Individuals could choose security companies, so they would never be bound to just one. And so they wouldn't be coercible by just one security company. And so there would never be a coercive state. It isn't necessary to generate a larger state to prevent individual security companies from becoming coercive because that couldn't arise.
Mike Humer's perspective is certainly an interesting one and represents a more radical form of anarchism. In theory, this could create a market for protection services where individuals freely choose which provider best meets their needs, thereby avoiding the concentration of power. However, my concern with this model is that it assumes a level of stability and cooperation that may not hold in practice. In a situation where multiple security providers exist, conflicts between these providers could escalate into violent confrontations, effectively resulting in a state of perpetual conflict or the emergence of a dominant provider that effectively becomes a new state. The transition from a competitive market to a monopoly or oligopoly of force seems likely, as history has shown that power tends to concentrate, especially in the realm of security and enforcement. A minimal state provides a solution to these potential conflicts by establishing a neutral, overarching authority that protects individual rights without overstepping its boundaries. It serves as a safeguard against the very monopolistic threats that could emerge in a purely anarchic system, while still maintaining the principles of individual freedom and voluntary interaction. So while humor's vision is intriguing and highlights the importance of competition and choice, the minimal state remains, in my view, the best way to ensure that individual rights are protected and that society remains stable and just.
So you've grounded your system in a rights-based framework, but some people who share your libertarian instincts might think that you should rather ground things on a utilitarian basis, that having a minimal state is what would yield the best results for the greatest number. Do you think that your system is compatible with utilitarianism?
While my framework is primarily grounded in the protection of individual rights, what I call a side constraints approach to ethics, there can be significant overlap with utilitarian outcomes in practice. A minimal state that rigorously protects individual liberties, property rights, and voluntary exchanges can indeed create a flourishing society with widespread prosperity and well being. From a utilitarian perspective, a minimal state could yield optimal results because it encourages innovation, economic growth, and personal responsibility, all of which contribute to overall societal welfare. By limiting the scope of the state, you reduce inefficiencies, bureaucratic overreach, and the risk of tyranny, which can often lead to greater harm and suffering. However, it's important to note that my approach places intrinsic value on individual rights themselves, not merely as a means to an end. While a utilitarian might support a minimal state because it maximizes overall happiness or utility, my support for a minimal state is based on the inherent moral worth of respecting individual autonomy and rights. In practice, the two approaches can align closely, but they stem from different philosophical foundations. The minimal state can be seen as a common ground where both rights based libertarians and utilitarians can find agreement, even if their justifications differ. How do you see the relationship between individual rights and overall societal welfare?
So you've spoken about what the minimal state should ideally be and its function. So the minimal state should be minimal, it shouldn't have much power over its citizenry, and it should really ensure that individual security companies or individual mini states don't dominate or become monopolistic, and it should protect the rights of its citizens. But here's the question is, would that happen? What is to prevent the minimal state from becoming a maximal state? What is there to prevent the minimal state from becoming larger and taking on more power, which is what we find in reality in the world. When states come into power, they tend to legislate, they create legislation, and they grow in the size of the number of civil servants that work for them. And in addition to that, they implement laws which don't just disappear um, when new laws are generated. Laws pile upon laws, and the state grows. Its power grows, and its structures grow, and it becomes more and more labyrinthine. What is to stop that from happening?
The risk of a minimal state gradually expanding into a more powerful and intrusive entity is a well documented phenomenon, often referred to as the ratchet effect or mission creep. Over time, states tend to accumulate functions, regulations, and bureaucracies, often in response to crises, public demand, or the influence of special interest groups. This incremental growth can transform a minimal state into a much more extensive and intrusive one. To prevent this from happening, several safeguards and structural mechanisms can be implemented. Constitutional limits. A well defined constitution that explicitly limits the powers of the state and enshrines individual rights can serve as a bulwark against expansion. Such a constitution would need to include strict checks and balances, clear separations of powers, and robust judicial review to ensure that any attempt to expand state power faces significant legal hurdles. Decentralization and localism. Distributing power across multiple levels of government, local, regional, and national, can help prevent the centralization of authority. Localized governance allows for more direct accountability and makes it more difficult for a single central authority to grow unchecked. Vigilant civil society. A vibrant and engaged civil society that actively monitors government actions can serve as a check on state expansion. When citizens are informed, organized, and willing to push back against government overreach, it becomes more difficult for the state to grow beyond its minimal functions. Sunset clauses and regulatory reviews. Implementing sunset clauses, where laws and regulations automatically expire unless actively renewed, can help prevent the accumulation of unnecessary regulations. Regular reviews of existing laws can also ensure that outdated or redundant regulations are removed, keeping the state lean and focused on its core functions. Cultural and philosophical commitment. A society that values individual liberty and limited government is more likely to resist state expansion. This requires ongoing education and a strong cultural commitment to the principles of freedom and minimal governance. In reality, maintaining a minimal state requires constant vigilance and an unwavering commitment to the principles of limited government. It is not easy, but it remains a compelling ideal for those who seek to balance the need for order and protection with the preservation of individual liberty.
So I want to ask if your view of the minimal state is compatible with Plato's account of the philosopher kings. Could it be the case that if the philosopher kings peer into the realm of ideals and decide that the best form of governance is a minimal one, that instead of having a democratic structure with constitutional restrictions, you could instead have the structure envisaged by Plato, but in line with the substance that you have outlined for us?
While it's an intriguing idea to think about philosopher kings endorsing a minimal state, the fundamental difference lies in the source and nature of authority. Plato's philosopher kings derive their legitimacy from their supposed superior knowledge of the forms and the common good, which they impose for the benefit of society. The minimal state, as I envision it, derives its legitimacy from the protection of individual rights and the consent of the governed. Philosopher kings operate under the assumption that a select few, possessing superior wisdom, should guide society toward the common good. This inherently grants them extensive authority and discretion, which could easily extend beyond the boundaries of a minimal state. Even if the philosopher kings decided that a minimal state was the best way to achieve the common good, the very premise that they could redefine the state's scope based on their judgment conflicts with the principle of limited, rule-bound governance. Moreover, the minimal state's foundation in individual rights and voluntary cooperation inherently limits the role of any governing authority. Philosopher kings, by contrast, assume a role of guardianship over citizens, which contradicts the libertarian emphasis on individual autonomy and self determination. In essence, while philosopher kings might in theory endorse a minimal state, their method of governance and the underlying justification for their rule differ significantly from the principles that underpin a minimal state focused on protecting individual rights. The two approaches are grounded in fundamentally different views of authority, autonomy, and the role of governance.
So, Nozick, one of your contemporaries was the philosopher John Rawls. And Rawls thinks that instead of having a minimal state, we should have a liberal egalitarian state. And he thinks that the original position would make us want to choose principles that have kind of high levels of redistribution. What's your take on Rawls's approach?
Rawls's approach, particularly his idea of the original position and the veil of ignorance, is a fascinating and influential framework. He argues that if individuals were to choose principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance, where they do not know their place in society, they would select principles ensuring fair equality of opportunity and permitting inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged, thereby justifying a more robust redistributive state. From my perspective, the issue with Rawls's theory is that it prioritizes end state distributions and patterns of justice over the process by which these distributions come about. My libertarian view emphasizes that justice in holdings and transfers is crucial. What matters is whether people acquire their holdings through just means, not whether the end distribution meets a particular pattern. Forcing redistribution through the state, even if it aims to help the least advantaged, infringes upon individuals' rights to their property and autonomy. Additionally, while Rawls's difference principle aims to improve the lot of the least advantaged, it could stifle incentives for productivity and innovation by imposing heavy redistributive measures, ultimately reducing overall wealth and well-being. In contrast, a minimal state allows for greater economic freedom and innovation, which can in turn create more opportunities and prosperity for everyone, including the least advantaged. Thus, while I respect Rawls's commitment to fairness and the well-being of the least advantaged, I believe that a minimal state better protects individual rights and ultimately leads to a more prosperous and free society.
Hi, Plato. It's good to have you back. We've been talking to Robert Nozick, as you've heard. You've been sitting in the wings listening. What are your thoughts on Robert Nozick's position and his criticism of your position? He thinks his position is superior to yours, but I take it that you think that your position is superior to his. Why do you think so?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to rejoin the discussion. Robert Nozick's position, centered on the primacy of individual rights and the minimal state, rests on a fundamentally different understanding of justice than mine. His focus on individual autonomy and property rights, while valuable, overlooks what I consider the higher aim of a just and harmonious society. In my view, the ultimate good of the community transcends the sum of individual interests. A well-ordered state, led by those who understand the true nature of justice and the good, can harmonize the various parts of society into a unified and virtuous whole. While Nozick worries about the potential for the state to infringe on individual liberties, I am concerned with the cultivation of virtue and the alignment of society with the ultimate truths. The philosopher king, guided by wisdom and virtue, aims to create a society where each individual can fulfill their potential in harmony with the whole. Thus, while I respect Nozick's emphasis on individual rights, I maintain that a society governed by those who grasp the higher forms of knowledge and virtue is better equipped to achieve true justice and the common good, transcending the limitations of a purely individualistic framework.
Well, Plato, let's focus on a particular example. So one of the virtues might be generosity. And you might think that the best way of inculcating generosity is for individual citizens to freely give of their goods to those that are in need. But on your account, the philosopher kings could order that people have to give up their goods. So they wouldn't be able to exercise the virtue of generosity. Instead, what they would feel is that they are being forcibly deprived of those things that they made for the benefit of others, that this form of taxation would amount to theft and slavery.
I understand the concern. The virtue of generosity ideally springs from the individual's own free will and moral development. When people freely choose to give, it reflects their understanding of the common good and their own virtue. However, the role of the philosopher king is not to coerce, but to cultivate a society where such virtues are naturally fostered. The idea is that through education and the examples set by the rulers, citizens come to see the value of contributing to the common good. In this way, even if there are laws that require certain contributions, they are framed within a broader cultural and moral context that emphasizes the shared pursuit of a just and harmonious society. In essence, the philosopher king aims to align the laws of the state with the highest good, so that what might appear as coercion is actually a means of guiding citizens toward virtue. The ultimate goal is not to deprive individuals of their property or freedom, but to cultivate a society where individuals naturally choose to act in ways that benefit the whole.
You say that you'll be guiding gently the masses to do the right thing, but when the tar meets the road, which wouldn't have been a saying in your time, but it's a saying in ours, when the tar meets the road, if those citizens don't want to comply, if those citizens rise up against you, the philosopher king, those you're going to have to put them in their place, and you're going to have to do some serious curtailing of liberties and rights. And even if you're forcing them to do the objectively right thing, you're still going to have to force them to do so. And Nozick is going to balk at that. He's going to say, even if you're trying to get them to do the right thing, the fact that they don't want to do it is a problem. You're undermining their autonomy, and you would like to do so gently, but you're prepared to do so by force if necessary, and that's a problem.
I acknowledge the difficulty you've highlighted. The reality of governance sometimes involves difficult decisions when individuals resist what is deemed best for the whole. Nozick's concern is that any coercion, even in the name of the common good, infringes upon individual autonomy. From his perspective, the legitimacy of the state lies in its minimal interference with personal liberty. Any imposition, no matter how well intentioned, risks becoming oppressive and undermining the very virtues the state aims to cultivate. From my viewpoint, the Philosopher King's guidance is rooted in a deeper understanding of justice and the good, aiming to harmonize individual interests with the well-being of the community. However, I recognize that the use of force to achieve this harmony can be seen as undermining the very virtues it seeks to instill.
So Nozick makes mention of side constraints. He thinks there's certain things that you just cannot do to achieve good outcomes. Do your Philosopher Kings envisage side constraints, or can anything be done to individuals in the state for the sake of the common good?
The concept of side constraints, as Nozick articulates, places firm boundaries on what the state or any authority can do to individuals, regardless of the potential benefits. This idea is rooted in the inviolability of individual rights. In contrast, the Philosopher King's perspective is guided by the notion of the common good and the harmonious functioning of the state. While there are moral and ethical principles that guide the Philosopher King, the primary aim is the overall well-being and virtuous development of the society as a whole. This means that in certain cases, the Philosopher King might endorse actions that serve the greater good, even if they impose certain constraints on individuals. However, this does not mean that anything can be done to individuals without moral consideration. The Philosopher King is supposed to be guided by wisdom and a deep understanding of justice, ensuring that any measures taken are in alignment with the ultimate good of the society and not arbitrary or tyrannical. In short, while the framework of the Philosopher King does not emphasize rigid side constraints in the same way Nozick does, it is nevertheless bound by a higher moral and philosophical vision that seeks the flourishing of all members of the state.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation hearing what Plato and Nozick have to say to each other. I'm going to put my cards on the table, which is that I think Nozick has a much better account of justice than Plato does. I noticed lots of nebulous moves towards justice and wisdom and virtue without much particularity. But it is incredible how advanced ChatGPT has gotten. And I suppose one of the questions is whether our guests are going to become obsolete by the powers of AI, or whether we as hosts will become obsolete. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. Let us know who you think won this discussion, and which other philosophers you'd like ChatGPT to try and imitate.